Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim daf samach chet. Today's daf is sponsored by Michelle Hagler on behalf of her daughters, Alyssa and Reagan Edelstein, whose love of Gemara was the impetus for my own learning. Okay, I want to also thank everybody who joined the Circle of Friends. It's amazing to see all the people who help support, and you can still continue to support if you haven't yet done it. And I just want to thank everybody for all the beautiful messages they've been sending, and I really appreciate it. It gives me a lot of strength to continue. I would like to start with a review of yesterday's daf. So what we saw was at the bottom of Samach Vav Amud Bet, Na'ara, beginning of the 10th chapter, Na'ara hamurasa avia u'ba'ala mefirim nedareha. So we have a woman who's betrothed, and while she's in this in-between stage between getting married and father's house, both her father and her husband together annul her vows. It sounds very even at this point. Okay, today we're going to start talking about not so clear that it's as even as we thought. And even though the Mishna makes it pretty clear, the next Mishna really doesn't. And we're not going to read we're not going to get to the next Mishna yet today. It's on Daf Ayin, but we will reference it in today's class because it's going to come up. So what we saw yesterday, after a little bit of dealing with the language of the Mishnah, we then moved on to what is the source for this halacha. So the first source we saw, and today we'll start to get some more clues about why do they have the power to annul the vows of the woman. I want to point out, I can't remember now if I said this or not, but that it was a way of somewhat protecting the woman from making these vows that she might get herself stuck into a place where she doesn't want to be. And they make it much easier. It's a much easier process for the husband or the father to annul the vow than it is hatarat nedarim, like we talked about she'elat chacham, going to someone, you have to come up with harata, you have to come up, right, either regret or a petach, had you known this and that. And remember, that wasn't always easy, if they were being honest, so it's not always true that had you known that, you wouldn't have taken the vow. So this is a much easier, in a case where father doesn't annul, the husband doesn't annul, still the wife can go on her own and do a she'elat chacham. She can always get the neder annulled in the regular method. This is a way of kind of speeding up the process and making it much simpler to get rid of her vows. Again, why and all that, could be understood maybe societally, what was going on. Maybe this was something women often took vows and they wanted to protect them from taking these unnecessary vows. Again, the last chapter ended with all these husbands taking these unnecessary vows, and we don't see that they have this easy way to get out of that. So it's definitely raises questions that I don't have all the answers to. So the first source, I will talk about things I do have answers to. So the first source is, where do we get this from? So the first one says Raba, and that's what we dealt with through most of yesterday's Shiur, was the pasuk. There were the three sections in the Torah. First, a woman when she's in her father's house, then a woman when she's betrothed, then a woman when she's married. When she's married, the husband. When she's in the father's house, the father. And then in this middle section, it said the husband can do it. Although we proved, again, it was a little back and forth, and how do you know for sure? But we proved that basically it means the husband does it. And since it has a vav, it connects to the first section, which again is strange because all the sections started with a vav, but we'll talk about why it's so obvious to them today. Obviously the father, the Torah was adding also the husband in this betrothed state. Okay, and that's where Raba gets it from. He says, she gets betrothed to a man and she has vows upon her. The husband can annul them, the Torah said, and the assumption is, and also from the previous section, we learned that the father can annul them. So we'll come back to why it's so obvious to them in a little bit. Today, we're going to see a different source, and then we're going to have that ping pong. Well, if he learns it from somewhere else, what does he do with that verse? And if he learns it from somewhere else, what does he do with the other ones first? So, debate Rabbi Yishmael Tana. First of all, there's a study guide today that will help you, so you can open it if you want. If someone wants to put it in the chat, I'm not sure if anyone did, but you can follow along. Debate Rabbi Yishmael Tana. Ben ish leishto, ben av lebito, mikan lenara muasa shavia u'ba'ala mefirim nedarim. So the braita from the house of Rabbi Yishmael taught that it comes from a different verse in that section. So let's read the verse. And where is the verse in that section? So this verse is the summary verse. So again, we have section 1, woman in her father's house. Section 2, woman betrothed. Section 3, woman in a married state. Then it says, Eila hachukim asher tziva Hashem et Moshe, ben ish liishto, ben av lebito, ben ureha beit avia. Now, perhaps Rabbi Yishmael is troubled by the fact that Raba's proof pasuk is not a great pasuk because it only talks about the husband and it doesn't talk about the father. So if we want to find a pasuk that talks about the husband and the father, we have a better verse. What is it? It's the last verse of the section, the summary verse in Bamidbar, chapter 30, verse 17. These are the laws that God commanded Moshe between husband and wife, between father and daughter. Here come the key words. Bineureha beit avia, when she is a na'ara, that's the one we're talking about, right? Not yet a bogeret, beit avia, in her father's house. Now, you could easily read this pasuk very differently. You could say, or maybe I should explain how he reads it first, but I want to read you the simple reading of this pasuk. This is a summary after the entire section, and it says everything we just learned discusses issues between husband and wife, without saying it, but obviously when they're married, and between father and daughter when she is in her father's house. But the drasha reads it as, Bineureha beit avia, when she's in her father's house, these are the things between her and her husband, which is really her fiance, because the Torah doesn't distinguish fiance and husband, because again, our fiance is not their fiance. Their fiance was actually, you need a get if you want to get divorced from a betrothal. A betrothal is like a marriage, right? It's what we do. If you're new to the Daf Yomi and you haven't been learning Sinks-Tuba, which we discussed many times, I'll do a review, which is what we do under the chuppah. First, we do berkat kiddushin or erusin, which is the kiddushin, and the husband gives the wife a ring. And then we do, that's why we usually split it by the reading of the ketubah to differentiate between these two sections. And then we have the marriage. That's the sheva brachot. And the chuppah is also, in any case, even though we do the first part under the chuppah also, but the idea is the chuppah is the marriage part and the sheva brachot. So in those days, they did it usually about a year before. So since they did it a year before, but the kiddushin can only be broken by divorce. It's not like an engagement nowadays. So basically what we're saying is, and normally in the engagement period, she would still be living in her father's house. So he says, we learn it from the juxtaposition of ish lishto av lebito, both them, bineureha beit avia, when she's still in her father's house. So even though the pshat, when you read it, and since this is the summary pasuk, it doesn't really sound like it's talking about that, but that's what the drasha is to say. Okay, the drasha reads it a little bit differently, as drashot do, take it out of the simple reading, but there's definitely basis in the text for this. And the Ram really explains it. Okay, he says, number one, the first part of the Ran on our daf, I'm skipping the Dibur Matchil, the darkened part, but then right, he says, Demashma ben aram muasar. It must be talking about an aram muasar because it says bineureha beit avia. And since midesamach av lebito bahade ish, because right next to av lebito it says ish v'ishto, it must mean that both of them annul her vows together. So now we have to do the ping pong. What does he do with that pasuk? Which is the pasuk where Raba learned it from. He uses it for a different drasha of Rava. Okay, what's idach de Rava? The Gemara doesn't tell us. So if you look in the Ran tells us the Amar lekaman. Okay, the next Ran on the page. Makish kodmei avaya shniya lekodmei avaya rishona. He says it's a drasha that we find on Daf Ayin, which is, it sounds very complicated. These words I'll explain to you kind of in a simple way, which is hayotiyeh leish. Hayotiyeh is a double language. So double language means there's two betrothals being discussed here. Now, what it says is the way a woman is before her first betrothal is going to be the same as the way she is before the second betrothal. Okay, they say it in the reverse, but I'm saying it in a way that makes a little more sense to explain. What does that mean? Before she's betrothed the first time, who has exclusive rights to annul her vows? Her father. So therefore, before she's betrothed the second time, her father also has exclusive rights to annul her vows. Doesn't mean before she's a second time. What it means is if a woman gets betrothed and then divorced from the betrothal, or the husband dies, the father goes back to having exclusive rights to her vows. Okay, if you remember, we learned some things that she doesn't always go back to the father's house 100%. So in this case, okay, it's actually similar to truma. Okay, truma, for example, If she's betrothed only, right, and she was eating truma in her father's house and she was betrothed to a Yisrael, right, then she can go back to eating truma in her father's house. If she was already married to him, she can't go back. So I think if I remember all the details correctly of that, it's too early in the morning for me to remember everything. So I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. So in this case, for sure, it's the case where we're basically saying that's hayotiyeh. If something happens from the first betrothal and she's kind of in waiting for her next betrothal, she goes back to being the exclusive rights of her father. He can annul all her vows by himself. That's what it's telling you. And that's what he does with the drasha of Raba. Okay, it's a little confusing. Rava. Okay, Raba's with a hey. He's the one who had the different proof pasuk. And this drasha of Rabbi Yishmael is using for some other drasha that Rava says. And it's particularly confusing because there's a mistake in the text here. Ule Raba, it should say in the next words. And there's a little note that says that, that takes you to the side to tell you this is a mistake. It should be Raba because we're talking about Raba in our sugya. Ule Raba, hi detani debe Rabbi Yishmael my avidle. What does he do with that summary verse at the end there that says, Ben ish lishto, ben av lebito? What does he learn with that? It's to come teach you that the husband, and now we're going to start to get some clues about what vows the husband can annul, and therefore what kind of power does he have and where does this power come from? So a husband can only be annul vows that have to do with the two of them. Okay, we're going to get to this later. And what are they exactly? Like, for example, one of the examples is if she says, I won't put makeup on at all. She doesn't want to look presentable. So that has to do with his relationship with her, which one could question what's that his business, but you could see why someone might think it's his business. And things that have to do with them and their relationship, okay, that he's allowed to annul. Things that she vows that don't have to do with his relationship. Now, there's one exception to the rule, which is the main category, and that comes explicitly from the psukim because it says "Le'asor isal al nafsha." She does something on, like forbids something on her soul. From there, they learn inoi nefesh. He can annul any vows that, like, let's say she says, "I won't eat." Okay, that's bad for her, right? Or I won't eat a particular food. That's hard for her, and if it's going to cause her suffering, then he can annul the vow. So there's two categories, okay? Nefesh is learned from somewhere else. And this pasuk comes to teach you, bein ish lishto, what's it telling you? Only things that are bein ish lishto, only things that have to do with the relationship is he allowed to annul. Now, there's a fascinating machloket that comes out of this, which is, right now we learned that a husband can only annul vows between him and her, and inoi nefesh. What about a father? Okay, so the Ran says, and based on a Sifri, which is a Midrash halacha, the Ran in the Dibor Matchil, Lomar Shabal Mefer Dvarim Shebeno Lebena, a little further down, he says, Ki hechi dabal eno mefer b'nidrei ishto ela nedarim sheyesh b'hem inoi nefesh udvarim shebeno lebena, just like the husband can only annul those kinds. Hachinami av eno mefer b'nidrei bito ela elu bilvad. Likewise, a father can only. And where do they get it from? Well, they get it because look at the pasuk. It says, ben ish lishto, ben av lebito. So this is what you call a het case. They're juxtaposed in the verse. And therefore, we're going to assume if the husband can only do things that are beno lebena, then the father can also only do things that are beno lebena. And that are basically have to do with him, like let's say the daughter says, I won't let you benefit from me. Okay, so that has to do with him. He can annul that. Okay, so that's what we have. The Ran says, it's obvious, even though the Gemara only said it about a husband, it's obvious it applies to the father as well. Now, the Rambam totally disagrees with this. In fact, the Ran in his commentary, if you look at the very last line of the Ran there, and the Rambam is clear that he's made for only the Nedarim of just confusing all the words today. A father can annul all vows of the daughter. Anything. Okay, so there's a huge debate because that's a very big, right, range between. Now, obviously, if you say ben up, if it's only things between her and him, it's also inoi nefesh, right? It's inoi nefesh and dvarim shebeno lebena. And according to the Rambam, that's not true. For the father, he can do everything. For the Ran, the father is just like the husband. And it's fascinating. There's a Rambam. So the commentary on the Rambam, the Migdal Oz, the commentary from Spain in the 13th century, says, where did the Rambam get this from? In other words, how does the Rambam ignore the Sifri? Because the Sifri is a midrash halacha. It's from the time of the Tanaim. How does he just ignore it? Because the Sifri says, we make this hekesh. So he has a great answer. And in there, he gives 3 answers. I'll deal with the first 2 for today. He says, number 1, you could say, okay, there's this concept. I'll let's teach you other things while we're learning, which is there's concepts. We've learned this before. Stam Mishna Rabbi Meir. If you have a Mishna without a name, we assume it's attributed to Rabbi Meir. Stam Tosefta, we attribute to Stam Tosefta Rabbi Chia. No, I think it's Rabbi Chia. Anyway, now I'm getting confused. But a Stam Sifri is Rabbi Yishmael. So he says very simply, the Sifri doesn't bother us. It's Rabbi Yishmael's opinion, and we don't hold by Rabbi Yishmael. It's a dat yachidus, we say. So he totally pushes the Sifri aside. That's one answer. Another answer, he says, if there was really this hekesh between the father and the husband, from this ben ish l'ishto, ben av l'bito, the Gemara would have said it explicitly, and the Gemara never says there's a hekesh. So the fact that Sifri says it, okay, that maybe is Rabbi Shimon's opinion, but he says it in this great word. There's no way that this would be halacha, and the Gemara wouldn't say anything about it. So from the fact that it's not in the Gemara, must be it's not the case. So he makes a bunch of arguments as to where the Rambam gets this from, and he basically quotes, says it here about beinola beinai. I'll give you homework as we're learning, right? Homework to do during class, which is pay attention to any time this issue comes up about dvarim shebeinola beinai. It only talks about it when it comes to the husband, never talks about it about the father. So that's kind of the way the Migdal Oz supports the Rambam in saying it seems pretty clear that that's not the case. Okay. So there's a big debate here, which again is, and I told you we're going to get to some clues today about, is there the nature of their hafara, right? In the Mishna, it seems like they're both equal, but we're going to see they're not exactly equal, okay? It's not exactly the case. So here comes our next question. And from here also, there's a bit of a debate about how to understand this question. Ibailu, Baal. So notice the questions about the Baal, about the husband. So now, I see you're helping me out in the chat with this. Right, Rabbi Chia is the one who did the Tosefta, but the Stam Tosefta is Rabbi Nechemia. No, I don't think that's really interesting. Rabbi Yochanan says Stam Tosefta is Rabbi Nechemia. Interesting. Okay, thank you for quoting that. Yeah, I wonder if there's other opinions also. Okay, anyway, thank you. Thank you for quoting that. Okay, that's why I got confused, because Rabbi Yechia is the one who organized the Tosefta, like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did the Mishna. That's why, as I was saying it, I realized, wait a minute, we don't say Stam Mishna or Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and that's where I got tripped up. Okay, so now we're going to see here. Baal Megas Gais or Miklash Kalish? Here's a question that we're actually not going to even see the answer in today's daf, even though we're only on the first half of Amud Aleph. Okay, we're going to have a long Tosefta that only at the very end are they going to get to the answer in tomorrow's daf. It's a fascinating question. When a husband annuls the vow of his wife, together with the father, right? So he's doing part. How do we view his partial annulling of the vow? Is it megas gais? Is he cutting it off? Meaning, it's like the husband's in charge of 50% of the vow, and the father's in charge of 50% of that. So the husband gets rid of his 50%. We're still left with 50%. And then, right, 50% of it is at 0, and the other is still at 100%. Oh, miklash kalish. Or is he weakening the entire vow? Okay, does he have, it's almost like saying, does he have access to the entire vow, and does he only weaken it? So what's the significance here? So first, before they get to the answer, they're going to ask how to understand the question, meaning, really, what are the ramifications? Who cares, right? And what's the difference, really? I mean, it's a nice theoretical argument. How does it work exactly? But in the end, he does 50%, he does 50%, he weakens it, the other one weakens it more, and it's gone. And, what's the difference? So they say, where's the question asked? Kigon, they give an example where there would be a serious ramification. Kigon de Nedarim mitrein zeitim. She said, I'm not going to eat these 2 olives. Vishama arus, her fiance hears. Veheferla, and he knocks, right? He does his annulling of the vow. Val chaltinu, and then she eats them both. Now, iamrina megas gaius. If you say he cuts out the vow, then what happened? She vowed about 2 olives. one of them is no longer forbidden to her, but the other one is still fully forbidden to her because he only cut off the 50% that he had access to. That's at 0, but the other one's at full. So the Ran says she would have to eat both olives, because if she only eats one olive, we don't know, was it the olive that he annulled or was it not the olive that he annulled? But if she eats both olives, in those 2 olives is one olive that's not forbidden to her and one olive that's totally forbidden to her. And then Lakya, she would get lashes because she went against her vow, because the father never annulled it in this case. But if he weakens everything, then we have 2 olives that are forbidden to her, but they're only forbidden to her at a height of 50%, right? They're not forbidden at 100%. They're only forbidden at 50%, and both of them are at 50%. So now if she goes against the vow, she's going against a weakened vow, which means, right, she's not going to get lashes. Isura ba'almahu. It's just forbidden to her because the vow is never annulled, but it's only a 50% power. So she can't get lashes for something that she did at 50% power. You won't only get lashes if you do it at 100%. So again, that's the question. Does he get rid of part of it fully? In which case, in a case like this, again, you would have to have a case where there's ramification, where there's 2 olives and then she eats one and not the other. I'm sorry, she eats both. One is definitely not forbidden, but one is 100% forbidden to her because it's an olive. Now, there's a whole question. I'm not going to get off into the commentaries about why did they have to make it an olive and a vow. Even any amount you eat would be going against the vow. And there's a whole discussion about that, because it seems like they picked a case where an olive, because an olive is usually the requisite amount for eating, right? For a requisite amount for forbidden foods. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that whole thing, but know that there's a discussion about that. But in this case, she's eaten a full isur and olive, okay? And therefore she went against the vow and she gets lashes. But if you weaken it, then no, then she did something that was wrong, but it was just wrong. It wasn't, she's not going to get lashes for it. To which the Gemara says, man. So what's the answer? Now, before we start, I want to point out that the Ran says, notice, this goes back to, again, the father and the husband. The question is asked about the husband, okay? So the Ran says they could have asked this question about the father as well, okay? It's just random that they use the word husband. It could have been the question about the father. It's about one of the two because they're both kind of one and the same. But the Ritva says, he doesn't say explicitly the question is not about the father, but there are some people who say that. And the Ritva says explicitly, and I want to read it to you. It's a very interesting Ritva, and it's very important in terms of understanding how Hafara works. So the Ritva says, Tama de Milta, okay, he tries to explain the whole reason why in general, how this whole thing works. Here, I'll read and then I'll explain. Mishum de mina erusin, ha'av ikar v'habal tafel. Okay, you know, ikar and tafel is main one, central one. Tafel is the side, right? It's an extra. When it comes to a woman who's betrothed, even though what's fascinating is the Torah gave rights to the husband. And we talked about it before, this vav, and how do you get it from the vav? The Ran says it's just obvious because in Erusin, the father is clearly the main character. He's the one in charge of the daughter. The daughter's still living in the father's house. And he's actually trying to explain the next Mishna. Okay, maybe I'll read you the next Mishna because it's going to be the next thing we're going to learn here, which is the next Mishna on Daf Ayin says, Meita'av, if the father dies, lo nitro kna reshut labal. If the father dies while she's betrothed, and she already made a vow that, let's say, the father heard or didn't hear, we're going to get into all the options of this in another few minutes. The husband doesn't have full rights. He can't annul the vow at this point once the father dies. He doesn't have rights to annul the vow. He can annul, obviously, any future vows that she makes because the father's no longer in the picture. And then obviously he doesn't have rights. But if the vow was made when the father was still alive, nitrochna means emptied out, okay? The father's rights are not emptied out to the husband. However, meit habal, if the husband dies, nitrokna reshut la'av. The father gets all the rights that the husband had. And bezeh yafeh koach ha'av mikoach habal. In this way, the father has more koach than the baal. And the Mishna is going to say this different thing that the father has more koach. That's not for today. So the Ritva is coming to explain that principle. Why does the father get the rights to the husband if the husband dies, whereas the husband doesn't get rights to do the vows if the father dies? And the reason is, this is what the Ritva is explaining, because when she's in this Erusin time period, it's the father who's the central figure. She's still living in his house. She's still under his authority, so to speak. And the husband is secondary. Talmud, and now here he proves it because he says, and here he gets into, which we're going to see on Daf Ayin Gimel, but we'll read it already now because the Ritva says it. The way Hafarat Nedarim works, is based on what Rabbi Pinchas says. Anyone who vows is doing it. When she takes a vow, she's doing it knowing that I'm only doing it if my husband's okay with this. It's hard for us to see this in modern eyes, right? That you wouldn't do anything unless you know your husband's okay with it. But to a certain extent, you can understand, especially if we're talking about beino lebeina. If it affects him, then you're only going to do it if he's okay with it. And again, remember it in historical context. It's okay. So now he's going to explain it. It's a known thing. One can just assume that this would be the case. That it's obvious. Okay, and obviously, though, only in Nedarim that are relevant to him, like Inoi Nefesh, if it's gonna, she's gonna suffer from it, or it's Beino Lebeina. Okay, and then he says later on, V'chein Pershu B'Tosfo, Hilkach Mina Elusim. So now you have to explain. If the whole principle is, why does a husband, when they're married, have rights to annul her vows? It's because we assume that she's only vowing within her mind that he will agree. Now, then he says, what if she doesn't? We assume it goes by most women. Okay, the way most women are. Then he says, but when they're betrothed and they haven't yet had relations, consummated the marriage yet, she'ein liba gaspo. She doesn't feel this strong connection to him yet because they haven't consummated the marriage. So therefore, eina noderet legamre al da'ato shel harus. She's only partially thinking about him. She's not fully thinking about him. And therefore, Ela Torah asa'ato snifim la'av. She's somewhat belonging to him, but only somewhat. So the Torah gave him some extra, right? The Torah said, well, listen, because she's somewhat already under your domain, in your domain, we're going to allow the husband to add to the father, but we're not going to allow him to take the place of the father because he's not in that position yet. Okay. And their relationship is not such that we're assuming she's vowing al da'ato. Okay. Whereas the father, and here I think we can get to maybe distinguishing. Number one, the two of them we see now, according to the Ritva at least, and it's also supported by Yerushalmi. I'm not going to read you all these sources because it's too much in depth for us, but it seems that the Yerushalmi also, the Yerushalmi kind of says this is clear and something else is questionable, and he kind of, questions. It's not so clear to him that it's clear that there's a difference between the father and the power of the father and the power of during the Erusin, the engagement time period, the father clearly has more rights, and that's why, according to Raba, it was so obvious. Torah doesn't even need to say about the father because obviously the father is in charge. It's just that we're giving the husband extra power, and then we're basically, or extra rights, I would say. And then that's the additional part. That's what the Torah has to tell us because it's additional, it's not obvious. And then according to the Ritva, it's less strong. Okay. And that's based on the Mishna. Okay. The father dies, the husband doesn't have any rights to annul vows that were from before. So why would this be? So I think if you think about the relationship between a husband and wife and a father and daughter, it's a very different kind of relationship. And it could be that the hafara, again, this is a suggestion, is coming from a different nature of hafara. With the father, right, if you think about child and parent, and certainly in those days where, nowadays we all complain that all the boundaries and the distance between father and parent and child is already not the way it used to be, right? We all say, oh, the way we were when we were kids, and the way our parents, for sure, it was very different. Like my father would just say, my father would never allow that kind of thing, and I say the same thing in my house, my father would. But the father had a certain amount of authority over the daughter, and that's authority. It comes from, you're under my domain, so I can annul your vows. It's a certain power kind of thing. Whereas when it comes to, and then you still have to explain why it's not for sons. This doesn't explain everything, okay? But then the husband, it's not an authority thing. It's that he has, either we call it rights in the marriage, that he can annul these vows, and it's only things that relate to him. And this goes well if you say that there's a difference also in the previous, that the father can annul all vows. The husband can only annul things that affect him directly. And it's because, again, if we combine it with what the Ritva says, based on Rabbi Pinchas, it comes up in the Gemara, it's only because she vows knowing I'm only vowing on things that my husband will be okay with, as relate to him, right? Again, only things that relate to him have effects on him. And then so it's a different nature of hafara, even though, right, from the Mishna, it seems so clear, Baal and father, Mifirim Nedarim together as if they're equal. But as we dig deeper, we see they're not really so equal. And it could be coming from a different nature of the relationship and a different reason why they get to annul the vows. Okay, so moving on. So we want to know, so again, this question could be about the father and the husband. It could be just about the husband. Okay, but in any case, let's try to deal with the question. The question is, does he cut it off or, right, cut off 50%, or does he weaken the whole thing? Now, put the question out of your mind for a little bit. We're going to go into this Tosefta and only really tomorrow get to the answer to the question. So the Tosefta wants to know, Tashma, so they say, let's learn this from this Tosefta. In which case, now we're going to get more into this whole idea about the father ends up with full rights. In what case? Okay, when can the father annul the vow if the husband's no longer in the picture? Again, we're only talking about vows that happen while both were still in the picture. She took a vow, and then something happened to one of them, and then does the father get rights, let's say, if the husband dies? So they're going to distinguish between different cases here. Bisman shalosh, we're going to have three options here that we're going to all say that works. The father's going to get full rights in these cases, and then we're going to say two options of where it's not going to work. Bisman shalosh shama habal kodem she'amut. Number one, the husband didn't even hear the vow, and then he drops dead. Okay, so we never heard the vow. In that case, again, if we use the Ritva's glasses and we read this sugya as well, the husband was only an accessory anyway. So obviously revert back to the father. Oh, now here there's a girsa problem. Okay, we're going to go with the girsa of the Bach. Oh, sheshama vehefel. Oh, the husband heard and annulled the vow. So then, of course, the father can also annul the vow. In other words, the husband already did the annulling. And if the father, let's say, didn't hear till after, and the husband's already dead, but he can annul the vow too. Oh, sheshama v'shatak umet bo bayom. Or he heard and he was silent, the husband. Now, silence, we normally, right? Silence means he didn't annul the vow, which means he kept the vow, which means he was okay, right? He thought the vow was a good vow. But that's only if, right? How long does the husband have? We'll get it to this. He has that whole day. So if he was silent for, let's say, a few hours, but the day didn't pass, and before the day ended, he died. So we didn't have an option to fully opt out, right? To say, oh, I'm not going to annul it because the day didn't finish. So then, basically what we're looking for is we want to make sure the husband wasn't what we call mikayemet haneder, that the husband didn't say, I want this neder to be, I'm good with this neder. So in all these cases, either he didn't hear, so obviously there was no kiyum, or he heard and did hafara, he annulled it, so there was no kiyum, or he heard and was silent, but he died that same day before the whole day passed, and his option to annul was still there. So therefore, that's not kiyum. So in all those cases, in those cases, the father gets full rights. But now turning to Amud Bet, but if he heard and he said, I'm good with this vow, or he heard, was silent, didn't say anything, but then already died the next day, or obviously, a month later, whatever it is, at that point, the father, let's say the father hears about the vow later, he can't do anything about it because the husband had already been mekayim. So now we're limiting this ability of the father to have full rights is only if the husband didn't do what we call kiyum haned. Okay, that's the first thing we say. Now, what the Tosefta is going to do is explain. We basically in the idea of nitrokna or not nitrokna. Okay, one died. So we're going to have four different options. Okay, how do we get to four options? Because we have two issues. One of them heard and one of them died. It could be the one who heard died, or it could be the one who heard and the other one died. And it could be starting with the father, ending with the husband, starting with the husband, ending with the father. So we're going to have four options here. We're only going to do three today. And we'll get to the fourth tomorrow's daf. And from the fourth, we're going to get to our answer. So that's why we're not going to get to our answer today. Shama avia veheferla. So the father heard and annulled the vow. Below he speak, this is the opposite case that we just saw. So the father hears the vow, he annuls it. Below he speak ba'al lishmoa ad shemei ta'av. What happened though? The husband didn't hear until the father's already dead. Zoe shashaninu mei ta'av lo nitrokna reshut laba'al. Now we see that this is exactly the distinction the Mishna sets up, which is even if the father annulled the vow before he died, and theoretically we'd say, well, all that's left for the husband is what? To annul his part. But we don't say that. Okay, it doesn't work that way. Because again, the husband does not have the same power as the father. So if the father's no longer in the picture, it's as if when he died, his hafara was kind of neutralized. And therefore, we're left with nothing. The husband has no rights to do anything. That's what the Mishnah said. The husband does not get the rights. Lo nitrokna reshut laba. Second case, which is a repeat of the case we discussed in the beginning, it's at least one of the options. Shama ba'ala veheferla, if the husband heard and annulled the vow. Below he speak ha'av lishmoa ad shemet haba'al, and the father didn't hear until the husband died, and then he hears about the vow. Zoe shashaninu meit haba'al nitrokna reshut laba. Okay, so those are the two reverse cases. And when it happens that the husband annulled and then died, and the father then hears about the vow, of course he can annul it because he really has full rights. Whereas when it happens the reverse with the husband doesn't have the same rights as the father, since, again, this you have to remember, it's very important to distinguish. Any vow she makes from here on in, it's only the husband's, right, if it's the case where the father died. But we're talking about vows that happened when the father was still alive. Since the father was still alive and he's no longer, even if he annulled the vow, it doesn't matter. You need the father to be there when the husband annuls it, and since he's not there, the husband doesn't have the power to do it. Next case. Shama ba'ala veheferla. If the father hears, he does the annulling. V'lo ispika av lishmoa ad shemet, and the father doesn't hear until the husband dies. Till the father dies. Okay, so now what happened? This is the other option. The husband hears and annuls the vow. Then the father never heard the vow, and then the father dies. Okay, this is different. The first case, the father heard and even annulled it, right? And then he died. In this case, the husband heard and annulled, and then the father dies. And the father never heard. So, now theoretically, you could have said the same thing. This is lo nitrokna reshut laba. But they say something even more. In the first case, at least the father annulled. In this case, there was no annulment by the father. So of course he can't do it because the husband only has rights to annul with a partner, with the father. And the father didn't do any annulling. He never even heard the vow, and now he's dead. So of course the husband doesn't have rights in this case. Okay, what we're going to get to tomorrow and start tomorrow's daf off is the fourth permutation, which we haven't gotten to yet. And we're going to see that there's actually a machloket about this case. And in the end, I'll kind of give it away, but they're going to say that the machloket is all dependent on whether you say miklash kalish or megas gayis. So we're going to get to that tomorrow, and we'll do a bit of a review of the question, and then we'll see it in the answer. We'll see how they get to an answer. So with that, we'll finish today's daf. So again, just to review a few of the things that we saw, more of the things that were, I'll review the daf and then review some of the things off the daf. We had Rabbi Yishmael brought a different proof than Raba. So we have two different proofs where we learn that the father and the husband annul the vow. And then we had a question when the husband annuls the vow, and possibly it's also about the father, we don't know. Is he cutting it off, half of it entirely, or is he weakening the entire vow somewhat, right? But not fully. And then through that, we got into a Tosefta about how to understand the upcoming Mishnah about the difference between the father and the husband during the engagement period, that if the father is to die, the husband cannot have full rights to annul the vows that happened before his death. But if the husband dies, the father does have full rights. And that we supported by our explanation in the Ritva, who talked about that their power to annul is not the same. It's not equal. the father's the main person, the husband is an added accessory. He gets some rights, but he's not really the main character here. And that's why we can possibly explain the difference. And we also discuss, which is related to this idea about if they're coming from a different nature, then maybe also there's a debate about, is their ability, which vows they can annul, are they the same or different? Is the husband more limited in what he can annul rather than the father? According to the Ran, no, they're both limited in the same way. According to the Rambam, they're very different. The father has many more rights to annul vows. He can annul all of her vows, and the husband only has rights to annul certain vows. So anyway, that's a lot of food for thought, a lot of intro terms, in terms of things that you should be thinking about as we learn the upcoming sugyot, as the issues that are kind of beneath the surface about this whole annulment of vows of the father and of the husband. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov.